Okay, we'll get started. Hopefully everyone who is wanting to join us has had an opportunity to get registered and join us. Good afternoon. My name is Ann Siren. I'm the town's interim comprehensive planning manager, and please welcome to our open house on the town's short-term rental initiative. I'd like to welcome town council members Mr. Ames, Mr. Lennox, and Mr. Brown, who are joining us today. Thank you for joining us. I'm part of the town's short-term rental initiative team. The other members joining me today are Renee Phillips, who's running our webinar, and Terry Lewis, Nicole Dixon, Jamie Lopko, and Teresa Haley. I have a couple of notes before we begin. This webinar is being recorded, and a copy will be available on the town's website, along with notes and the questions that were submitted during the webinar. I'll start with the presentation and then open the floor to your questions. You can either ask a question using the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, or you can ask a question aloud if you click the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. Just a note, our survey closed on Monday, and the results will be posted to the short-term rental initiative page shortly, and we will send out a notification to folks who have signed up for project updates. The results will be available in two forms. One will be a single PDF document, so you can see all of the results in one location, or you can view the results through the Open Town Hall portal. And there are some interesting filters that you can use to break down the results by geographic location, demographics, and different factors. So if you're a numbers person, you want to take a look at that. You can also share comments with staff and the committee by using the comment form on the town's website. So this afternoon, I'd like to briefly summarize our efforts so far and then discuss our findings and learnings. We've received a tremendous amount of feedback on this initiative. And using that information and the information we have on short-term rental trends, staff made initial recommendations to the Public Planning Committee on January 27th. So I'll describe our recommendations and the path forward. So I will start the presentation now. Give me just a moment. Okay. So this afternoon, we'll review the project purpose statement before taking a deeper look at short-term rental trends. I'll summarize the feedback we've received so far and pull out some themes that we've heard from that feedback. And I'll draw conclusions based on the feedback we've received and our learning so far. I'll review our preliminary policy framework that we presented to the Public Planning Committee on January 27th. And then I'll review our plan for continuing to monitor and analyze short-term rental trends and their impacts. So this effort is part of the town's recently adopted strategic plan, and the purpose statement outlines what we're trying to do. We need to develop a fair, balanced, and predictable approach to managing the impacts of short-term rentals on the island. And this is available on the town's website if you want to take a longer look at it. First, as part of our learnings, let's take a look at the trends in short-term rentals in the past 2 years. On this chart, we have data from 3 short-term rental monitoring companies. Each company is represented by a different color here on the graph. We anonymize them because they gave us the data as part of software demonstrations. So starting back in September, of 2019, the companies reported that there were between 4,000 and 6,000 short-term rentals on the island. And by September of 2021, they reported that there were between 8,000 and 11,500 short-term rentals on the island. Just a couple of notes about the data. We got 2 data points from 2 of the companies. So you can see the green and orange lines only have these 2 data points here, whereas the blue line shows trend lines throughout the months during that time. And you can see this sharp increase here between January 2021 and July 2021, and then it kind of leveling off during the last quarter of last year. And we'll confirm this data shortly. We have a contract now with a short-term rental monitoring company, which I'll mention in a minute. So some of this data, there's a variation in the data based on how it is verified by the companies. So that's why there's a difference in some of these numbers. But if we average the three estimates, that's a 96% increase in short-term rentals in 2 years, which is the equivalent of about 4,800 units. So for most of the units obviously aren't new builds, they're conversions from existing units to short-term rentals. So for context, 4,800 units is a little less than the total number of units in Palmetto Dunes. And in 2018, we had about 34,500 housing units total on the island, to give you some context. So these trend lines show a sharp increase in the short-term rental market in a relatively short amount of time. Given the size and importance of the short-term rental market on the island, it clearly warrants our attention and further analysis. So it's a sudden increase and it's a big change, but is it a problem? I think we can draw some preliminary conclusions from this trend data and the feedback we received, and I'll discuss that in a minute. Regarding data acquisition, we decided to work with AirDNA to provide constant monitoring of short-term rental properties. And so I'll have that data shortly, and we'll be able to share that with the committee. This will give us a comprehensive picture of short-term rentals, including the total number of rentals and their locations. The data will be available by month, starting with November 2014 through today. And so we'll have a good deal of data on the listing type, the location, maximum occupancy, number of bedrooms, the date the property was first offered as a short-term rental, back to November of 2014, the time of year the properties are rented, and the number of nights rented per year. So we'll get a really good understanding of the short-term rental market on the island. We'll also have monthly performance information like total reservation days and occupancy. So with this information, we can do a deeper dive on short-term rental trends by location, not just absolute numbers. And we can use AirDNA to continue to monitor short-term rental trends. So will the trend of a sharp increase in short-term rental units continue? Probably not at the same rate that we saw on that blue line between January 2021 and July 2021. We already saw that blue line was leveling off. Will it continue to slow down? Will it maintain that speed? We don't know, but we'll have that information from the contract with AirDNA. So the short-term rental trends were part of what we used to understand short-term rentals and their impacts. The other input was stakeholder feedback. Starting in October, we identified and held 19 open houses, individual meetings, and group meetings with stakeholders. We sought a broad range of input from the large gated communities that do allow short-term rentals to realtors, the Chamber of Commerce, property management companies, neighborhood representatives, the sheriff's office. And again, we held those public open houses, one in public, and then this is our second virtual open house. So you can see we're gathered a wide range of input and focused neighborhood groups on North and Mid Island and then South Island. And here are the meetings that we've had in the last 2 weeks. We had about 500 people attend the 5 meetings that we held a couple of weeks ago, and about 150 attend this week's meetings. And let me just take a second to recognize the staff team that helped organize and run these meetings, particularly the webinars. Everyone's done an amazing job. Renee Phillips used a new platform for these meetings, which I think have run very smoothly and allowed everyone an option to participate and have their voices heard. So thank you very much to our team. The videos from these meetings are now online, and we will add the notes and questions and answers shortly. But what we've heard in these meetings is largely what we've heard before. We hear the same themes, the same problems and concerns are resonating again and again. And I'll discuss those in a minute. We had an overwhelming response to our survey, which closed on January 31st. We received 3,680 responses. And all of the results, as I mentioned earlier, will be posted on the town's short-term rental initiative page in 2 forms for you to take a look at. There will be a single document with all of the comments, and then you can kind of noodle through the data in the Open Town Hall portal. And I want to acknowledge and thank everyone who's taken time out of their day to tell us what their concerns are, to ask us questions, and to educate us. The kind of information and input we've received is truly invaluable. So while the detail that we received could be very specific, as I mentioned, what we heard fell into themes. And the first point I want to make is that everyone understands that short-term rentals are an extremely important part of our economy, and we don't want to do away with them. We can't just focus on the problems associated with short-term rentals. We need to acknowledge and understand the benefits that they provide to the community. Everyone that we spoke with said short-term rentals, they understand they subsidize residents' full-time residents' taxes. They pay A-tax fees. They increase property values, and they provide stimulation to the local economy through, dining out at restaurants and playing at golf courses and that kind of thing. They also help build the island's long-term resident community. So many of our full-time residents started out as guests in someone else's short-term rental, or they purchased a home or a condo and they rented it until they had moved here full-time. So we understand the benefits of short-term rentals, and I want to be clear that no one wants to do away with short-term rentals. Another point that we have heard, and I want to make sure we are clear that we understand, is that not all the nuisance issues that we're trying to address in our first set of recommendations are caused by short-term rentals. We have plenty of day visitors who make noise, park illegally, and litter. So this is not every bad thing is caused by short-term rentals. We understand that. We want to be clear about that. We also heard and understand that everyone has expectations. These aren't true for everyone, but generally speaking, short-term rentals owners expect to be able to rent out their properties without overbearing regulations and fees. Residents expect to enjoy their homes in peace, and while they're not against short-term rentals, they say there does need to be some level of standard of acceptable management and a way to resolve problems that do come up. So we've heard people ask, why are you doing this? What's the problem? We've certainly heard from folks who think there's no problem at all. Someone in a survey said, quote unquote, fine as is. But we've heard from many people who are experiencing the strain that short-term rentals have put on their neighborhoods. During one of our earlier stakeholder meetings, a resident of Sea Pines described how the behavior of guests in a short-term rental next to his house had really severely and negatively impacted his life. It's a repeated problem for him. It's not just, every guest, but it seems to be that the way the house is being marketed by the owner invites noise and disturbance. And he's lived there for a long time. He lived in an area where he expected to enjoy peace and quiet in a residential neighborhood, and that's been changed by the short-term rental next to him. And we've heard and read complaints about quality of life issues like this again and again. And you can see them in the comments that we received in the survey, in the emails that we received, in the phone calls. Folks say there are too many vehicles and they park on the street, or they park in the yard, or they park on my yard. The renters are playing loud music and they party late into the night. And I can hear it in my house, or during the day for that matter. Or they leave, piles of trash that I can see from my house, or they litter. And those aren't the only concerns that we heard about short-term rentals. Those are the nuisance issues. There are some quality of life issues that are a little bit more deeply rooted that I'll talk about in a minute. So if you were to ask, do we have a problem? I would say, based on the trends that we've seen and the feedback we've received, I would say with the dramatic increase in the number of short-term rental units in the past few years, there's an even greater need to address quality of life issues by requiring a basic level of operation and management for short-term rental properties. Many short-term rental owners have responded to this by saying, well, that's not my rental. I take pride in owning a well-maintained property. I have occupancy limits. I have a minimum night stay. I screen my guests, and I respond right away if there's an issue. And I think that's true. I think many short-term rental property owners are well managed, and that's evident in the feedback that we've received from folks who don't think there's a problem. But I also think that shows that no one finds those kind of nuisance issues acceptable. We've also, as I mentioned, heard and read concerns about deeper rooted issues. not just nuisance issues, but the decline of residential neighborhoods. Decline meaning the change in residential use from being a residential area to more of a commercial area. Folks have described them as mini hotels. My neighborhood is full of mini hotels now. And that includes neighborhoods inside the larger gated communities that allow short-term rentals and those outside those gated communities like North Forest Beach and Folly Field. Some of the deeper rooted issues we've heard about include, again, the impacts of the number of short-term rentals impacting housing availability. So if you have a short-term rental that's used to be occupied by a full-time resident or long-term renter, that's now a short-term rental. About the simultaneous reduction in the amount of housing for workers and the increased demand for workers because you have more visitors. There are concerns about the wear and tear on the island's infrastructure, roads, impacts on water and sewer capacity, on the quality of the environment, on the island's brand generally, on the value of short-term rentals themselves. So if there's too many short-term rentals, would a night's stay be reduced? So if you ask, do we have a problem with these issues? I think the answer is, I'm not sure that we know yet. There certainly has been a change in short-term rentals, and there's certainly some amount of encroachment on traditional neighborhoods and some amount of additional burden on the environment or infrastructure. There could be some market saturation. I don't think we have enough data to definitively state what the problem is yet. So we consider all this feedback and what we know about trends in short-term rentals to develop some preliminary findings. So we found that there is strong support for an ordinance to address the organization, the character, the expectations, and operations of short-term rentals. So many folks agree, just like we heard Jack Daly say during one of the stakeholder meetings previously, there needs to be some sort of basic level of expectations for how short-term rentals operate. And I would refer you to the feedback that we've received in the survey, the comments we've received during stakeholder meetings and open houses, and the calls and emails that we've received that echo that sentiment. We also found that at this time, there's limited support for an ordinance that would significantly impact the operations of short-term rentals before we fully understand and evaluate the problem and the results of the actions that we might take. So again, do we have a problem with the total number of short-term rentals on the island or where they're located? I would say at this point, we don't have enough information to definitively know the answer to that question. But the rise in the number of short-term rentals certainly warrants further monitoring and consideration of those issues. As we have more information on short-term rental trends through our continuous monitoring contract, as we gather more information through the island-wide conditions and trends assessment, I think we can evaluate the sort of larger concerns like the quality of life of single-family neighborhoods that has changed. Again, the amount of worker housing, the impact on the environment, all of those issues I think require additional data to fully understand before discussing possible solutions. So based on the feedback we've received and our learnings to date, staff recommended to the Public Planning Committee a preliminary policy framework. And that includes standards for property management, safety, noise, trash, and parking. And I'll detail each of these first before describing how we might consider enacting this ordinance or these regulations. But I want to note that these are in a draft format intentionally. When staff brought them to the Public Planning Committee, we wanted to understand, get their response to that, get their feedback, understand what their questions are. So these are in a draft format. These will inevitably change as we refine the regulations and get additional feedback from the committee. But the initial response from the committee during their meeting on January 27th was, we generally support this direction. Please return to us with more details. So we'll get started in reviewing each of these. We recommended creating a standard that owners or their agents be available to address problems within an hour of being notified. A couple of notes on that. An agent can be any person or company designated by the owner to serve as a primary point of contact. We heard from a lot of owners who say, I don't need a property management company. I handle my property in the way that I do. And I think we're looking at outcome, not method. What we want is the result. If there is an issue that comes up and someone contacts the owner or their agent, that within an hour, someone has responded. Now, that doesn't mean the issue will be resolved within an hour, because there could be some cases where a guest parks on someone else's property or in the street, and that guest goes to the beach. And so even if the owner or property manager comes out to the property to try to resolve it, the person with the keys is not available or the house is empty. So understanding that an hour response time doesn't mean an hour resolution time for the problem. The goal is to have a point of contact who's designated, who can respond when issues arise. Regarding safety, we're recommending that owners affirm their units have basic safety elements in place. So smoke and carbon monoxide detectors, fire extinguishers, clear exits, and that they have some sort of pool safety measures in place. So that could be fencing, or it could be a water level monitor or a door alarm. But the idea is that, especially for pool safety, if you have folks, you know, and especially families, maybe with small kids who are in an unusual environment, everyone's excited to see each other, maybe not paying attention. We want to make sure that there's some sort of safety measure in place so that if a door is left open, and, you know, if so there is a way to prevent a child from accidentally falling into a pool, or if they do, that there's an alarm that goes off. So we're refining those details, but want to have some basic safety in place. Regarding noise, similarly, we're recommending that the owners affirm that the town's noise standards are displayed in the units. The town's municipal code states it's unlawful to unreasonably disturb the peace and quiet of those in their homes. Quiet hours specifically are between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. If you're making an unreasonable racket during the day and unreasonably disturbing the peace of someone inside their homes, that is also a violation. We're recommending that owners provide affirm that they are providing a designated location to dispose, or a system or a location to dispose of trash. That trash, if it is stored outside, it's going to be screened from view from neighbors or the public right of way. We're recommending that all vehicles be located on site. So for a single family residence, that means on that property. For a multifamily development like a condo or a villa, that the parking be located on the entire property. So it could be that you have a designated space or two under your unit, and then a couple of either designated or non-designated spaces and an open lot on the site. As long as the parking is located on site, it would be compliant. And that each vehicle has a pass. Our initial thought was that the limit would be up to 6, depending on the size of the property. We're taking a look at that to see if that makes sense. And that parking must comply with private covenants. If you have covenants that say you can't park in your yard or on pine straw, that you don't do that. So these are the basic elements of the framework. Again, you can see from the survey responses, from feedback that we've received, there is strong support for some basic universal standards for how short-term rentals operate as a business. And as I said before, many short-term rentals owners have told us, I take care of my property. For those folks, meeting these requirements should only involve submitting additional paperwork with their business license, affirming that they do meet those standards. Now let me explain our initial thoughts about how this would go into effect. So since all short-term rentals must now have a town business license, it makes sense to include the required information with the business license application. So our initial thought is this wouldn't require an additional fee. The owner would simply add the information to their business license application, affirming that they meet those requirements. And our initial thought is that the effective date of the ordinance would be July 1st. Now, it could be that that's not feasible, and we will revisit that with the committee. But let's say the effective date is July 1st. What would that mean? That means that everyone who has a business license, 2022 business license, or submitted their application by July 1st, which is the effective date, wouldn't have to submit that additional paperwork confirming they meet the requirements, and wouldn't have to meet those requirements for the rest of 2022, the calendar year. If you apply for or renew your business license after the effective date of the ordinance, you would need to submit that additional paperwork and meet those requirements. So let me run through a couple of scenarios. So if you are a short-term rental owner and you have your business license today, if the effective date of this ordinance is July 1st, you would not need to submit the additional paperwork or meet the requirements until you resubmit for your, or you reapply for your business license in January of 2023. If you have applied and haven't yet received, you'd have the same standards. If you submit your business license application or renew after that date, again, you would be required to submit the additional information and bring your property into compliance, meet the standards by that date. So the town discussed having a good neighbor brochure. A lot of communities have this. It's, you know, a flyer or a single sheet that says, you know, welcome to our area. We're happy to have you. We're a unique community in these ways. It could include some information about sea turtle protection, things like that, and that we would have that available for display in the unit. It would also include the compliance information about parking. What are the parking regulations? What are the noise regulations? So either we could have that available, or owners could say, I already have that information in my unit, and you know, I don't need to use your brochure. So they would affirm that on their business license application. But the goal is voluntary compliance through education. So I understand that this is going to be due to the number of short-term rental owners that we have. This is going to be a process of educating folks, you know, that we have these regulations and how to comply with them, and an understanding on everyone's part, in residents and owners alike, that we're not striving for perfection. What we're aiming for is a reasonable attempt to meet these requirements. And if there is a failure to do that repeatedly, or just, you know, no response from the owner, that the result could be that the town council considers suspending or revoking the owner's business license to operate that business, that short-term rental. Again, the town stands for code enforcement. Traditionally has been that we will try to educate folks, especially with the number of visitors that we have. I think it's important to have a welcoming atmosphere and focus on education instead of initially coming down with, you know, citations or towing right away. To try to educate folks, here are what our expectations are before trying to enforce those expectations through citations or towing or some sort of other violation. So for next steps, again, on January 27th, the Public Planning Committee approved the preliminary policy framework, which includes the recommendations that we just reviewed. The committee had comments and questions on several elements, and staff is including that feedback along with the public input we're receiving in drafting an ordinance with our code consultants. So we will present the draft ordinance to the Public Planning Committee on Thursday, February 24th. And at that meeting, the Public Planning Committee will review the draft ordinance and provide further direction to the staff, either to revise the ordinance and bring it back to the committee, or if they feel that it's ready, to forward the ordinance to town council for review. So that ordinance would address those quality of life issues, those basic operational concerns that folks have, and hopefully would provide a way to provide some relief for folks who are experiencing some negative externalities from some short-term rentals. In the meantime, staff recognizes that there are issues that we still need to fully understand and may need to take action on in the future. So we will continue to monitor and evaluate the effects of short-term rentals on residential neighborhoods, on the housing stock, on the environment. We'll use the data that we're collecting to really zero in to understand trends on neighborhoods and where issues are. So we want to take a look at, folks have mentioned mini hotels. How do we define those? Because that's a generic term. And what are the number, where are they located, if they're a problem or not? Because some areas, what one might consider a mini hotel is not a problem. In some areas, it is, folks have told us this is a problem. It could be, and so we want to look at the options for those, but first we need to understand more fully what the picture is. And with the data that we're getting, I think we'll be able to do that, and also with some other data sources that we're considering in other town initiatives. We'll continue to monitor those trends. And there's some news. There is state legislation that may affect the town's ordinance, so we're keeping an eye on that. Okay, so that before I open the floor to questions, I want to clarify a couple points. First, we welcome all of your feedback, and this isn't the only venue to share that feedback. As I mentioned, there's a form on the town's website you can use to submit additional feedback, all of which we are sharing with the Public Planning Committee. You can also submit comments to the committee before any of their meetings and sign up to speak during the meetings. If you go to the town's website, there's an e-subscription service, or if you go to the short-term rental initiative page on the town's website, there's a sign up for project updates button. So make sure that you sign up for project updates to receive notifications of upcoming meeting dates. As I mentioned, we'll put out a notification when the survey results are on the town's website and how to navigate to those. The second point is, at this point, again, we are working out the details of these requirements. Again, we presented them in a draft format, hoping to get feedback from the committee and further direction, which we've received, and getting feedback from the public and stakeholders. So this meeting is important. We are listening to what you have to say, and the draft ordinance will be the result of the feedback that we received from the committee and from the public. So with that, if you would like to ask your question out loud, sorry. Again, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box. If you want to type in a question, you can type in a question there, and someone who is working on the webinar will answer it. Someone on town staff will answer your question. Or again, if you want to ask a question out loud, there's a raise hand button, the little hand symbol at the bottom of your screen. If you hit that, I'll know that you want to be called on, and you can ask your question out loud. Okay, so we'll start. And Robert Shepard, Mr. Shepard. Sir, you may need to unmute on your end.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah, my name's Robert Shepard. My wife and I own a home in North Forest Beach. We bought it 3 years ago. We live in Ohio, and we rent it out during the summer, and we go there in the off season. And we've been coming down there for 35 years. I have a couple concerns. One, under the ordinance, it says that the license can be revoked or suspended, and I'm not sure what the process is for that, because that could be pretty tragic if you get a note in the mail that you can't rent out your property, which helps pay the mortgage. So I wasn't sure if they have any idea how that's going to run, if it's one person, a committee, or how the process would be if, for some reason that were to happen to somebody with a short-term rental. The next issue I have is on the pool fences. I'm not sure why they would require fences for pools for short-term rentals, but not for the other residents, because kids could drown in one of those pools just as easily. So I think if it's a safety concern, it should be, everybody has to have a fence around their pool, because your neighbor could have a pool 15 feet away and not have a fence, and the kid could fall in there just as easy. So I wasn't sure why that was even put out there when it's not going to be uniform across, the island. The next issue was I'd heard talk they were going to try to limit the number of guests that you could have at your house. And I wasn't sure what that had to do with any of these issues, if it's being properly managed, because you can have noise problems with, 5 or 6 people at a house, and where another house might have 20, people in there not making a sound. So I was just concerned if there's going to be a limit on the number of days or weeks you can rent your house, or the number of people that are staying there, because even if a house says we hold 8 people, you could very easily have, 15 or 20 sleeping on blow up beds or couches and so forth. The one big issue I had, I know this was talked about in a couple of meetings ago, if they were going to grandfather the current owners. because it's kind of awkward to come in and someone like, we bought a house, we fixed it up, put a lot of money into it, and then the rules change. So we weren't sure if they had talked much about grandfathering and how that would work. Finally, I know a couple meetings ago, there was a lot of talk about having to put signs on your property if you had a short-term rental. One solution might be up here in Columbus, Ohio, the county auditor has all the properties on their website. And a few years ago, they just added a link if it's properties being rented, whether it's apartment complex, single family, there had to be rental contact information on the auditor's website. So for instance, if you go to the website, you would put in, a street name there in Sea Pines, and then it would have the rental contact name or the management company, a phone number and an address. And that might help to alleviate the issue of people putting their name and their phone number on their house. That's all I had to say. I'll just wait to hear your response. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherd. I think I captured everything that you mentioned, and if I didn't at the end, please let me know. Regarding how business licenses are reviewed, the Towns and Municipal Code has standards about how public nuisance businesses that pose a public nuisance can be reviewed. Their business license can be reviewed by town council. So we have the standards in place in the municipal code. It would be reviewed by town council when the issue rises to the level of being a public nuisance. So there would be an attempt and multiple attempts to resolve the issue before it became to the point where there would be a hearing before town council. And that's the process. It's a hearing before town council. That is your process. You would present your information, the town staff would present theirs, and town council would ultimately make that decision. So that's the process. So there wouldn't be any sudden notices that your business license has been revoked in your mail. We would have contact with the property owner before, notifying that there is an issue. We would, again, attempt multiple times to resolve that issue without going to having a hearing with town council. But then if it rose to that level, there would be a hearing with town council.
Okay.
Regarding pool fences, and I understand, I take your point that pool safety, doesn't necessarily know property boundaries. Our reasoning with the particular importance of pool safety for short-term rentals is the unfamiliarity of the property and the circumstances. So again, if you're on vacation, you're unfamiliar with the property, you're also in a circumstance where you're not in your normal routine of maybe keeping as close an eye on, kids or pets as you normally would. So that's it raises the level of concern about security. While I certainly take your point that pool safety is for everyone. That was the reasoning behind that requirement or suggested requirement. In terms of other actions outside of these initial policy framework recommendations that the town might consider, such as limiting the number of guests, limiting the days you can rent, any grandfathering that may result as a process of that. We're not at that point yet. As I mentioned, we have our initial policy framework that we're going to work through with the committee. In the meantime, take a look at some of those larger issues. There are solutions that other communities have used, like requiring minimum night stay, limiting the total number of short-term rentals in a community, doing a percentage by location or even down to the street. There are a number of things that other communities have done to address the issues that they've had. I think we need to clearly define for us what the issues are, where they are, and then look at some options. And then the discussion of that, if we decide to move forward with actions to address that, would include a discussion of grandfathering, because we are certainly aware of and want to respect folks' property rights. And many owners have said, I bought this property specifically because I knew I could rent it out. Now, that's not the only reason I bought it, but I want to be able to rent it out. So we understand that. We've heard that. Regarding signs on the property, I appreciate your input about the website central location. We've heard a lot of comments about folks with concerns about privacy or safety, about having a sign stating that there is a property manager or a number to contact. So we're taking a look at a number of options as a way to address that. And I really appreciate your input in that suggestion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us today. And if, Is it Mr. Seister? Sir, you might need to unmute on your end.
Unmute. There you go.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, I live on North Forest Beach, and we have a condo on South Forest Beach, which I don't think is concerned because we have adequate parking and it's only a 2-bedroom, and we have a limit of 6 individuals can rent. But we bought the place with the idea that we might want to rent this house out in the summertime for a couple of months maybe. And now I'm concerned that, as the previous questioner is, about some of the restrictions that could apply. The first thing I want to ask, though, is, and I've missed other meetings, what words, I think there's 5 or 6 words in Hilton. What are the words that get the most complaints?
Oh, the voting wards?
Yes, the voting words, yes. In other words, which council member gets the most complaints? And have they brought this to the board from those complaints and said, look, I mean the council, we need to do something? Is that what initiated this action?
Sure. So we don't, obviously town council members receive communication from the public, and we don't track that. In terms of understanding code complaints, there are a few different sources of information. Some folks call the sheriff's office, and the sheriff's department reports on these types of nuisance complaints. More serious things, they actually write a report. In many cases, if it's a noise issue or a parking issue, they wouldn't write a report. They would just note the address, and then that no paperwork. I didn't write a report on it, but here's the date and time the incident occurred, and here's a general description: parking, noise. Obviously, the larger gated communities with the 24/7 security services, they have their own record keeping. And then we have town code enforcement record keeping that addresses, if we receive a complaint, and again, these are during our code enforcement officers generally work during the day, during the week, unless there's a specific need for them to not work outside of those times. So they may receive a complaint about an incident that happened at a different time, but I digress. But in any case, their data shows complaints throughout the entire island of different types of complaints. So as you might expect, the areas where there are more tourists, whether it's a short-term rental, a hotel, or someone who's just using their house seasonally, the areas that are more popular are going to have more complaints. There's more people, these types of noise complaints, but they're widespread. And I hope that answers your question. Back to how this arose. Yes, town council recognized that there were I guess two types of complaints. You can put them into 2 different buckets. There were nuisance complaints, and then there were the larger complaints, which cover a myriad of concerns that are more deep-rooted, like amount of available housing, wear and tear on infrastructure, environmental impacts, large houses and structures that are too large for the size of the lots. So all those types of complaints were received by town council, who directed staff to examine short-term rentals. That was part of the strategic plan that the town council just approved. Said, staff, please take a look at this and let's discuss some possible solutions.
Okay, so I guess from your answer is you don't have firm metrics for the various wards or the various neighborhoods on the amount of complaints. It's just island-wide data?
We do, and if you take a look at like the survey results, for example, or the comments that we received for folks who provided their address and the feedback we've received, you can get a better idea of where folks have concerns. So for folks who registered to take the survey, if they registered and have their address in our system, or their address, it wouldn't show you their address point, but it would say by neighborhood. So for example, we had, X number of respondents from the North Forest Beach area. You can take a look at the comments that they've submitted and see, are they a resident who has concerns about short-term rentals? What are those concerns? And a lot of folks have said, again, those same things that we heard that fall into those kind of two different categories of the nuisance complaints and then those larger complaints. So that you can take a look at that. You can take a look at the stakeholder meeting notes that we have on the website. You can review the videos of these webinars that we've had, and folks have said, here's the problem, and we've heard from kind of all over the island, less so in all over the island for areas that have short-term rentals. Obviously folks who live in Spanish Wells or in Hilton Implementation where they don't allow short-term rentals, or for Hilton Implementation only have like 3 or 4 that are grandfathered, they don't have those kind of complaints about short-term rentals. In the areas where they're allowed, it's fairly widespread.
Well, I guess I'm just looking for specific metrics, numbers, and if you have citations or you have calls or whatever, you should be able to put those numbers together and identify the problem areas specifically with good solid metrics, not just people generally grousing about having a problem, and part of a survey. Surveys are not a good way to establish solid metrics. So, and then the other question I have is, it has to do with enforcement. Now, my understanding would be, you have a neighbor, they're complaining, there's too many cars parked in, where they shouldn't be parked, or there's noise, etc. So that neighbor then would call and put in a complaint, right? I guess to code enforcement. But code enforcement, is, at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night, they're going to call, right, and put in a complaint. Now, what would stop a neighbor from being a nuisance neighbor and simply complaining without verification? Who's going to verify the complaint? If it happens on a Saturday night and code enforcement doesn't work Saturday nights, who is going to verify that the complaint is real?
So yeah, a couple of people have mentioned that, nosy neighbors or neighbors who are a nuisance issue. The philosophy and the direction that we've received so far is that the first point of contact, it makes sense if you are operating a short-term rental, that the manager of the short-term rental will be the first point of contact. Now, that practically speaking, it may not happen. Folks may contact the sheriff's office, or they may contact town code enforcement. But the idea behind the regulations is that there's some sort of initial point of contact for folks who own short-term rentals, that they would provide that contact, and if there's an issue, they would call. I would say, as with the case of someone who's not doing short-term rental, who just has a troublesome neighbor who is always calling the police on them, or some sort of code enforcement officer on them, that would be handled civilly or criminally, I suppose. I'm not very familiar with the law enforcement process, but it would be the same kind of, you would handle that the same way that you would handle your house if you didn't have a short-term rental. If you were being felt as if you're being harassed, it would be the same process.
Well, let me just go back to what I said. Maybe you didn't understand what I was getting at. If a neighbor complains, there has to be a verification of the complaint. Is the town prepared to verify that the complaint is real? In other words, they have to show up and witness the problem.
I think I understand what you're saying. So if the town, for example, were to say, and I'm just using a hypothetical situation because there's no number associated with creating a public nuisance in the town code. So let's say you have 3 complaints within a certain amount of time. How do you count those complaints and say, yes, that's a verified complaint? I hope that's what you're asking.
That's exactly what I'm asking. Is
Sure.
The complaint really, if it's going to count against the property owner or the manager, the property owner, I guess, is in the end the person who will lose their right to rent, right? Not the management company. They'll move on to some other business, However, the management companies are going to have to respond. And is there any penalty for a management company that does not enforce the rules? Anything going to happen to the management company if they don't respond?
Sure. To address your points, first, Yes, I think you would need to present if there is a proposal to revoke a business license that would be based on evidence. So that would be verified by the town code enforcement staff, not just, this neighbor complained 50 times, so clearly there's a problem. We would need to verify that with evidence. To your second point, is the property manager going to be held accountable? I believe the direction is ultimately it's the owner's responsibility. So that may fall back with the owner saying the property manager is not managing this property correctly. Clearly, we're having complaints, and work with a different property manager. But ultimately, the responsibility would fall on the property owner.
Well, all right. So most of the contracts with property managers are 60 days before you can, separate your contract, with them. And so you could continue to have complaints. The gentleman that spoke just before me lives out of state. So if his property has to be managed by a property management company, then he has to depend on them to resolve the issue. And if it doesn't get resolved, he then is going to suffer a penalty. And what I'm asking, I guess, is there should be, if the property managers have to have a business license, correct? And if they do have a business license and they're not operating the business according to the town's regulations, they should lose their license.
The town, I just want to clarify, we're not requiring that that property owners secure a property manager with a business license to manage their property. The owner themselves could manage the property. They could have a friend or family member who's that point of contact to manage the property. So just to clarify that point, if I think that's a more of a separate contract issue between the owner and the property manager. If there was an issue where the property was being poorly managed, and while the owner was resolving that issue privately with their, because that's a private contract, if they communicated to the town, let's say there's a case of the out-of-town owner, they have a 60-day contract with a property management company, that company isn't managing the property well, and there are complaints, town code enforcement would be in touch with the owner to discuss those complaints. I guess in that situation, they could explain, listen, we've got company X is not doing a very good job. We're trying to get out of that contract. Please bear with us while we resolve this issue. And there would be a conversation about what the problems are and how they can be resolved.
Fair enough. However, the property managers run a business and they have to have a business license, don't they? In the state of Carolina.
For a property management company,
Correct.
yes, I believe, but I think you.
So we have the possibility of, instead of having that layer of a problem of property manager who's not properly responding when a complaint goes out, why would we not want to start penalizing the property manager if they're not following the rules associated with short-term rentals? That's their business, short-term rentals. And if they're not following the rules, they're not answering complaints, they're not solving a problem, they should be the first person that gets notified and also be part of the punitive process, basically, which means they should lose their license.
Well, they would certainly.
Anyhow, that's just my view. I believe that because the property managers quite often are the problem, they don't even drive by the house to see how many cars are parked out there. They really don't care how many people show up because they don't monitor. All they do is basically wait for a complaint. That's all they do. So they're not really managing the property once they take the deposit and agree to sign the rental contract. So why is the town not looking at their business license if they're not following the rules?
So I understand your point. I'll review our philosophy and how this would be handled. The owner, if they choose to use a property management company, would have a contract with them. If they're dissatisfied with the service they're providing, they can terminate that contract. In the meantime, if there's a delay in terminating the contract, then they can discuss that with the town. But ultimately, the owner is responsible for who they select to manage their property. So while certainly if there were an incident that were directed to town code enforcement officers, they would, if there were a property management company was the point of contact, they would certainly contact that property management company and say, there's a problem with one of your guests. This is the problem. And they would explain that to them. If they weren't responsive, they would contact the owner of the property and say, here was the problem with the guest. We, reached your point of contact. They didn't resolve the issue. So you need to be aware of that. And then that would be the conversation would be, how are you going to either, find a new company or work with a company that you do have to properly manage the short-term rental?
Okay, well, I understand getting the owner to make sure his property is being, not creating a nuisance. I understand that completely, and it's proper. However, many, many owners, as you know, live out of state. They can't get in the car, come down and resolve an issue. The first line of complaint has to be with the management company. Has to be. A lot of management companies actually have their telephone right out there because they want to advertise the property. So if a person calls up the management company, the neighbor calls up and complains, that management company should, I guess, forward that complaint on to a code enforcement people that, yes, a complaint was made for property I'm managing, or the neighbor should be able to say, look, I've called the management company 3 or 4 times. They're not doing anything, all right? So I guess then what you're saying is you need to go to the owner and have that property manager fired. But I really believe that since they have a business license, they should be operating under a certain set of rules too. And if they don't operate under those rules, then they should lose their license. Anyhow, that's my view, and thanks for your response.
I appreciate your feedback. Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Green? Dr. Green, you may need to unmute on your end.
Yes, okay. I think the gentleman that just spoke before me had some very good points, and I think you've missed these points on the property management companies. I agree totally with what he's saying about the responsibility of property management people, and they should be held accountable. And that's been totally left out of your equation on short-term rentals. The second thing I just wanted to discuss was the pool fencing. In our plantation, I am not allowed to put a fence around the boundaries of the properties, and there's no fences around the pools in back of us and on the side of us. So I could easily put a fence, I guess, around my pool if it's allowed, but that I have a huge yard that the kids are going to play in, and they're going to be in those other pools easily. So I'm not sure that that's going to solve the problem. So that's a problem that I have, because fencing is not allowed on the boundaries of our property to prevent children or whatever from getting into the neighbors' pools, which of course are unfenced. But after hearing the fellow before me, I think that's a really big issue that you are completely missing about the property management companies. And I would urge you to look at that more seriously in terms of them being accountable for managing the property, which is what they're getting paid for. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm certainly not an attorney, so some of these terms may not be correct, and I could be philosophically, legally incorrect, but my understanding is that the business owner is the person responsible. They're the person who holds the license. So if they have a contract with someone, that's a private agreement that they have, and if that private contract isn't being met, that's for the owner to determine and terminate the contract. So I believe having the property management company be responsible for violations of the behavior of the guests would be trying to manage the quality of their business instead of the outcomes of having the short-term rental property owner, the business owner, take responsibility for their business, which is the rental of the property. Now, again, I'm not an attorney, and when we bring that draft ordinance before the Public Planning Committee, our town attorney and our code reading consultants and our staff attorney, or excuse me, deputy town manager, who's an attorney, will be present and able to answer those questions and respond. But that's my basic understanding. Regarding pool fencing, I certainly take your point that requiring pool fencing or requiring pool safety for short-term rentals is not intended to solve all or alleviate all of the possibility for issues with pools. It could be that, you know, we have put in place safety measures for the short-term rental, but then there's an incident where the guest staying at the short-term rental, you know, a child wanders over to the other property and has an accident. And obviously that would be a tragedy, and we're, you know, that we would like to avoid all tragedies. What we're trying to do is not perfection, but an improvement, and put in some basic safety requirements, hoping to reduce the number of accidents or tragedies that might happen on a property. And in the case where folks find that pool fencing doesn't work for whatever reason for them, there's some alternate options. There are alarms that you can put, you know, in a lot of cases you have a sliding glass door or some sort of door that leads out to the pool area. And if the door is left open for too long, an alarm will go off. Or there are alarms for pool movement, like the waves in a pool or pool water levels, where if someone accidentally falls into the pool, an alarm would go off. So there are some different options that folks have. But again, what we're trying to do is put in some standards to try to alleviate, not totally prevent, but alleviate some accidents or tragedies that could happen. Ms. Harrington?
Yes, hi, how are you?
Hi.
Hi, I had a couple of questions. One is on Marshland Road, there's a development still in process of being built. They're tall, skinny houses. Apparently, when the applicant put in for that little development, no one realized they were all destined to be Airbnbs. Now, what I'm wondering is, has the town considered a moratorium on building of these small developments until we can be sure that they're really going to be residential? Because that doesn't fit there. These are working class neighborhoods. I do not understand how that happened. And frankly, they're quite hideous. Now, my second question is, on these multiple maximum occupancy McMansions, there more than several of them I've heard have been purchased from residents and retrofitted, and they have 6 bunk beds and one, basically it's an attic. There's nothing above you but roof. How is, and oftentimes on a 3rd floor, how does the fire department feel about that? Have you been working with the fire department to make sure that our codes are really up to speed, considering that we really haven't had this issue in past years or past decades? And I worry because I personally know a family that every member but one was lost in a relatively newly built home with a really fast moving fire. And I'd hate to see that happen here, simply because people were more worried about the income for that week than about the safety. And sprinklers being required in a 3rd floor, it comes to mind. Now, I'm not sure of the building codes or the fire department codes. I've only been here 10 years and I haven't read them all, but I will say that it's certainly something to be considered, because these high occupancy rentals, while they might squeeze the beds in, think about all those people trying to scramble out in a smoke-filled house. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you very
Sure.
much. I appreciate it. Those the issues that you mentioned are all part of the other category of issues that we want to examine and discuss regarding short-term rentals. So we've got our, you know, nuisance issues that we're proposing an ordinance for, and then other issues that we need to talk about. Regarding the location of short-term rentals, you know, some communities definitely have in their ordinance a restriction on where you can have short-term rentals. They can do it by zoning district, or, you know, different geographical designations. Some jurisdictions have definitely put in a maximum occupancy to prevent the type of mini hotel, as people refer to them. And those are options that we can look at. I think life safety is a serious issue that needs to be discussed and considered. And I think that definitely will be part of the discussion that we have. Do we want to regulate these, and if so, how? And so I appreciate you bringing up those points, and I noted those for our discussion later. Thank you. Mr. Prohaska, I hope I got it right this time.
Yeah, you did. Well done.
Okay, great, thank you.
I'm Alan Prohaska, and I'm going to address a few to the people who spoke before. I live in Shorewood on South Forest Beach, which is a resort community of 2 and 3 bedroom condos. I'm the president of an HOA for long-term rentals, homeowners, second homeowners on Marshland Road called Summer House. I've been on all these calls. I've talked to Ann. I've talked to numerous property management companies and owners, as well as my ward representative. To the gentleman who asked the question, whose ward is this happening in? It is predominantly in Tammy Becker's Ward 3, the Folly Field, Singleton Beach, Bradley Beach area, and North Forest Beach, all locations that do not have HOAs and regulations. The vast majority of the complaints, as best we can ascertain, and this is anecdotal information, is coming from what I call house hotels, and mentioned mini hotels. And this is the problem that's occurred in Hilton Head in the last few years. Vacasa, which is a local property management company who does good work in staying up on their properties, does have a property that sleeps 26, 4 that sleep 20, and those are in Sea Pines and Forest Beach. The vacation company has 376 properties, but only 2 that sleep 21 to 23. Now, those are local property management companies who do a very good job working with their owners and their guests. But VRBO has 107 properties that sleep 20, 11 that sleep 26, and 2 that sleep 30. These are properties that have been retrofitted to sleep masses, as somebody spoke about before, and they are not managed locally. Not some may, but most are not. Airbnb has 138 properties which sleep at least 16. They do not offer them to go any higher, but that doesn't mean the property doesn't sleep more. And this is where our problem is. Unfortunately, Ann, what you guys are doing with the short-term rental initiative is taking each short-term rental property and treating it the same. My 2-bedroom condo in a 30-unit building of where I have on-site people and where we have after-hours numbers to call and deal with issues, as well as the 34-unit property over in Folly Field, of where those are bachelorette, bachelor parties. There's no way they have only 6 cars. They're going to have 28 cars, and the infrastructure was not, when the building permits were issued, were not set up to handle that many cars to park on the street. That was not set up for water pressure for the poor people that are at the end of the road. And Mrs. Becker has shared a lot of concerns. And for those who were not on the planning committee meeting, her ward's affected. She is the only council member who voted against moving this short-term initiative forward to the planning commission to then take it on to town council. So the emphasis, again, to the people before, we're not looking, or I don't believe the town is looking at your 3 and 4 bedroom sleeping 8 to 10. They should be looking at 34 people with who knows how many cars, 9 bedrooms, 9 bathrooms, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully that clarifies that for some of the folks. There is information out there. Ann and her team have done a great job collecting a lot of it, but it's way too early to be moving it forward. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for joining us again. Oh, Mr. Ross?
Yes.
We can hear you, sir. Fire when ready.
Okay. Oh, all right. Sounds good. Well, thank you for being the interface between everybody. I've been to a lot of your meetings before, and you do a good job interfacing between the community and the town. So thank you for that. One thing I just wanted to ask was, I did read through your recommendation, the initial recommendation for the kind of phase one, so to speak, dealing with the more critical problems that people have been complaining about, which is trash, noise, parking. And it looked like, there was nothing that really took away property rights from owners, which is really the crux of the problem here, I think, for the majority of owners. And it looked like it was a really good, mostly a really good proposal for your first recommendation for an implementation of this. So I'm wondering why they don't stop at that to see if it works for maybe one season or 1 year, instead of marching right ahead in the next month trying to figure out how to take away property rights, like with occupancy limits and day limits and things like that. Why wouldn't they stop at the trash, noise, and parking with these good ideas to fix that problem, and then kind of like improve on that as time goes by, and try to come up with something that really works based on that first recommendation to town council? Seems like that would be great, because it would fix the problem potentially with the 3 big items and not cause massive lawsuits from taking away property rights from people. It's something more like a general ordinance rather than targeting certain people.
Yes, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. I think that we're solving for or identifying and trying to resolve at least 2 types of issues. And as you mentioned, the nuisance issues. And that's what we're trying to dial down into in this first ordinance. Not to imply that there will be necessarily a second, but the other issues are those kind of larger issues that aren't necessarily nuisance related. And we've heard from folks who are concerned about a variety of issues. I think probably the most outstanding concerns that folks have are probably because they're very visible and because of the issues that are related to them. So larger units on smaller lots, kind of mini hotels. But generally, there are also concerns about just the number of short-term rentals in residential neighborhoods, kind of that transition, that change from folks who, bought their property with the expectation and the understanding, because it's written in the code, that they're living in a residential area. It's supposed to be peaceful and quiet. It's supposed to be residential in nature. And that has transitioned over time to be more commercial in nature. So I think we need to take a look at those larger issues separate from kind of the nuisance issues that we're looking at in this ordinance, to determine what the scope and location of those issues are and options to address those. Now, in mentioning that, we have heard from so many people who own property, our consulting attorneys, everyone is very aware of property rights. And we certainly do not want to do anything that would be considered a taking of property rights. So when we have that discussion, it will include those same concerns. If we are going to have regulations, how do we put those regulations in place in a way that is fair, that respects property rights? So that will be part of the discussion that we need to have in considering any additional regulations we want to put into place.
Okay, well, on the recommendations, it talked about, some ideas to regulate trash, noise, and parking. And noise is probably right up there next to parking. But it talked about having, I own a short-term management company. So I'm kind of speaking as the owner of that. And one recommendation is there to be a number posted that would be a phone number to property management company to come out and be there within 1 hour. The problem is that my property managers are not the police department. So I don't think that the town can legislate our employees who are not law enforcement to basically go out and police a noise complaint. I mean, for police officers, domestic disturbances and traffic stops are like the most dangerous situations that a trained police officer can get into. And what I'm worried about is sending out a new property manager out to a property at 1 o'clock in the morning in the middle of the night with 18 people that are drunk partying. And, I'm concerned about their safety. And I think that That's very worrisome from a owning our company. I don't want to put my employees at risk by sending them out into a dangerous situation because Hilton Head doesn't have its own police department. And I don't want the town to try to legislate the property management companies to be the town's police department that they don't have. So that's concerning to me. And the other thing is that when you call our company and we have to respond with somebody within an hour, there's very limited amount of things we can do. Because, if you look in the Residential Landlord and Tenant Act in South Carolina, it is unlike our neighbors in North Carolina. In South Carolina, a short-term rental is regulated. We are regulated the same as a long-term rental. So, if I want to evict someone because they're behaving badly in our short-term rental, it would take 2 months going through the proper legal channels because South Carolina does not have any legal channels other than long-term renting. So the problem is the Residential Landlord and Tenant Act in South Carolina says that I need to give 24 hours notice before I can enter a property. So I can have my agent go out there and perhaps knock on the door, but we are limited to what our rights are as the landlord or the representative of the landlord or owner. We have to give 24 hours notice to do any kind of entry into the property. And when we go out there, we don't have any legal right to control or evict them. In North Carolina, that's different. They have a mechanism within like 4 hours, you can have a eviction from a short-term rental because they are treated differently under North Carolina law than a long-term rental. So when you send out our agents, not only are they maybe in harm's way because they're not trained in defense, in resolution management, none of the kind of skills that a police officer, for example, would have. And you're sending out all these agents that don't have this kind of training or skills, and they're almost acting as a pseudo police department for the town. And that isn't appropriate. And it's also not safe. And it's also not effective. So I think that if you want to do something, the number should be really calling the town to maybe a town hotline. And then maybe there might be a town, since you don't have a police department of your own, maybe you can have some kind of task force that then responds. That's not really a quasi police department, so to speak, that has the training to deal with these disturbances at short-term rentals that have some training instead of a property manager that would have no training of this sort. So, and the other issue was a lot of people talked about posting their private phone numbers on the short-term rentals. And I also have to agree with people with that private information should not be posted on people's rentals. I get 10 calls a day for people wanting to buy my house. I can't imagine how many phone calls I would get a day if I posted my phone number on the house. And I don't think that's safe. It's a privacy issue. It should be a number that's directed to the town. That's a hotline. They can register a complaint, in real time there with the town. And then the town can look up who it is and then contact the property manager on their behalf. And then the property manager will then, call and make their best attempts to contact the guests to tell them to be quiet or fix the problem. But I don't think property management companies should be sending employees out to potentially dangerous situation that the South Carolina laws don't allow them to do anything or act in any way to fix the problem. I just don't agree with the phone numbers either anywhere. And, and it's not very fair because I have, for example, long-term residents that live across the street from my short-term rental, and they're noisy and they can impact my guests. So where's the number for my guests to call? My guests are being annoyed by the long-term residents across the street. Where's their number to look up on the door of their front of their property so they can call the appropriate people to have them be quiet? So it's not fair because a lot of the long-term people that are living here actually disturb some of our guests. So I think if it goes one way, it should go the other way also, especially when the long-term residents are the ones that are, complaining and wanting this all to happen. So I think if one person has to list their number on the house, I think the long-term people need to also, because they're not, they shouldn't be exempt because sometimes they can also be the problem. So, but the big issue I had is that I think there needs to be another mechanism other than having a bunch of employees from property management companies putting themselves in harm's way, potentially being a pseudo police department for the town.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. I appreciate that. Just to address a couple of the points that you brought up, certainly if someone, either a guest or an owner, has a complaint, a noise complaint about someone, whether they're a short-term rental person or a long-term resident, they can certainly report that to the town. The town's municipal code applies to everyone in terms of noise. The issue is having someone who is a resident versus running kind of a business is the difference. But the same standards apply, for noise ordinance. So if there is an issue, we would certainly hope that folks would follow up because, I haven't heard necessarily about complaints about residents, but folks have mentioned, I have a short-term rental. I own next to a short-term rental. My short-term rental guests have previously been disturbed by the guests in the other short-term rental. So I've heard guests being too noisy and disturbing other guests, certainly. But in terms of we would never expect or want someone to put themselves in harm's way to, address an issue. Clearly, if, a property manager approached a property where there was a complaint and felt unsafe, we would certainly encourage them to contact the sheriff's department. But the intention is that they would have, and we certainly don't expect perfection. If a property owner has rents out, does due diligence and screening, puts a deposit in place, does all of the good practices that property owners do to make sure that they won't have an issue with their guests. If it turns out, they did everything they could, but they have noisy and disruptive guests, we certainly wouldn't consider that grounds for terminating their business license. If the complaint was reported to town code enforcement, town code enforcement would investigate and discuss with the property owner or their agent what the issue was. What happened, what steps did you have in place to screen your guests, kind of have that conversation about what their options are. But that wouldn't be, again, we're not trying to come at this as a way of being overly strict or overly punitive, but in some reasonable expectation of you own this property, you run this business, you need to have a certain level of expectation. Again, not perfection. And, we don't want anyone to be in harm's way. But there could be a phone call that's made to, the person doesn't necessarily have to be on site if they feel threatened, but a phone call made to the renter saying, hey, we received a noise complaint from the neighbors. You need to turn the music down, see the, information posted in the unit, you're being too noisy, see, the information on the listing, see the contract that you signed, you need to keep it down. If there's an issue where those, there's a repeat issue, there are other avenues that we could use to address that. But the intention is a basic level of operation and a way for folks who have a complaint to get in touch with the person operating that business, the short-term rental, to resolve that hopefully in a reasonable amount of time. But again, not expecting perfection. Ms. Scott?
Hi, just a few comments. In my experience with guests that are renting houses or properties, when there has been a complaint made to the sheriff's department will say, call the rental company. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I have called the rental company who turns around and says, call the sheriff's department. So you see a lot of pass the buck. Nobody wants to deal with it. I think that there's also a huge, that I find that there are a lot of bad players that are rented properties here. And there's no metrics that I'm seeing within the rental companies to make sure those people are not allowed back. And I speak about this from, wearing two hats. I'm a resident. I have 2 very small short-term rentals, and I dealt with the guests all the time. So there was never an issue of any problems because I was the firewall. So there were no sheriff's department officers that ever showed up at my properties. The other thing that I kind of noticed, since this is my 3rd session that I'm sitting in on, is I think it would be interesting to know when somebody speaks where they're coming from. Are you a resident? Do you have a short-term rental? Are you a property manager? I'm a little concerned that the voice of the resident is not necessarily heard. If we're looking at, I think, 86 short-term rental companies, not including any mom and pops and all of that, that's a very large voice. Granted, yes, they do have a voice and a right, but I'm worried that it may overshadow the residents. Well, that's all I had to add.
Thank you very much for your comments. I appreciate it. to speak to guests who are repeat problems, and to some extent, this is an issue where property management, the owners would need to, if they have repeat problems with folks, that would, be reported to code enforcement. And we would discuss that with the owner and possible solution. I know that some of the rental companies, the online booking companies, are looking at, I'm trying to remember the name of the program, but good community programs or good neighbor programs, where if there is a problem with a renter, like a significant issue, that they will, ban them from the platform and then notify other companies that they've had the problem. So they'll be banned from those platforms as well. So there are some private industry resolutions or solutions that are being considered to try to avoid those problematic guests. I think to some extent we need to work around folks. There will always be folks who don't want to follow the rules or who cause problems. We can try to address those the best we can. But I appreciate your comments, and I would encourage folks, if they do want to share, what their affiliation is, to please, feel free to do that. And I would say we tried our absolute best to get as much resident input as we can. We're holding public open houses. All the meetings are open to the public, but open houses to try to encourage folks who maybe weren't an identified member of one of the stakeholder groups to join. We had specific resident meetings, and we've been taking a careful look at the feedback that we received from residents, both in the survey and in emails and phone calls we've received, and shared that feedback. So we are trying our best to hear everyone's voice, and that certainly includes residents. And I appreciate you attending these meetings. Thank you. Ms. Meltzer?
Hi, I agree with a lot of things that everyone else has been saying. I am a half-time resident, rent for half-time. But the question that, the main question I would like to address is the question of the drownings and the safety of that. Has the town done any research, like how many child drownings have been here or near drownings? And if you don't have that information, then that's just like a feel-good ordinance that you're putting out there, and to apply it differently between residents and rental owners is just not fair. Because I live in Palmetto Dunes, so I have a community where there's a pool in every backyard. We are not allowed to put up a fence per ARB orders, but there's a canal that's like, 100 yards away. There's multiple little bodies of water. So there's thousands of places a child could wander to and drown. So unless we have a study of drownings and near drownings, then that's a completely arbitrary ordinance that's just going to inconvenience property owners who rent. And, you also would need to address, how are you going to manage that with the ARBs that we're covenanted to, and we've agreed to their rules. And then there's the question of liability, even more if that's the other ordinance, but our ordinance says we can't do that. So I think everything does need to be applied. Anything like that needs to be applied uniformly, but then also if there's not a problem, let's not create one.
Well, thank you, Ms. Meltzer. I appreciate your comments. Regarding pool safety, as I mentioned, we will make sure that all of the regulations that we are proposing are legally sound. I think my understanding, and I could be incorrect, so we will get confirmation from our attorneys, is that there can be some distinction drawn between a short-term rental as a business and a residence. And our goal is to increase safety. Now, we're not claiming that we can make everything perfectly safe, but to the extent that we can improve safety for folks, we would like to put those standards into place. I think there is some recognition that if you are in an unfamiliar location and in a circumstance that is unfamiliar to you or is out of your everyday norm. So if you're on vacation, you're kind of in vacation mentality. You may not be paying as close of attention to your surroundings, and you may not be as familiar with your surroundings as you normally would be. So the desire is in that kind of increased or different environment to increase safety to the extent that we can. And I appreciate your point. I think safety should be across the board for everyone. I think what we're looking at are options that work for everyone and can be legally enforced. So if you, and we recognize that there are POAs and HOAs who don't allow fencing, or folks maybe don't want to use a fence. I think in that case, we have some options. There are new technologies that can be applied that wouldn't violate those covenants. That are, for example, door alarms. If doors that lead to areas where there are pools are left open for a certain amount of time, the alarm goes off notifying folks that there's an open door. And maybe a child slipped through there when you weren't noticing. So to close the door and make sure that that is safe. There are also, I think, more directly helpful are water level monitoring systems that can be put into place for pools. So when the pool isn't in use, and the water level changes suddenly, an alarm sounds so that folks know, hey, maybe a child or a pet has fallen into the pool. So that's our intention with the ordinance. We'll make sure again that there are options for folks who have POA or HOA or private covenants that wouldn't allow them to have pool fencing or who don't want to use that as an option, and that whatever ordinance that we put into place is legally sound and fair and can be defended. Just as a reminder, at the bottom of your screen, there are a couple of icons that you can use to comment. There is a Q&A button with 2 little speech bubbles on it. If you click on that and type in a question, someone on the town staff team will answer that question for you in writing. And then there is a hand symbol with a raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. And if you want to ask a question out loud, you can hit that button and we'll let you know that we're ready to hear your question. Just as a notification, if you've heard things today, you've had additional comments that you want to submit, or if there's someone who wasn't able to attend these meetings and they would like to submit comments, there's a form on the town's website under the short-term rental initiative page where you can submit comments that will be shared with the Public Planning Committee. You can also on that website sign up for project updates. And I would encourage you, if you haven't already done that, to do that. We'll send out an email notifying you of upcoming meetings related to this initiative. So when the agenda is published for the February 24th Public Planning Committee meeting, we will send out an email notifying you that that agenda is published and you can see the materials that the committee will review before the meeting. And so it'll also include options on that agenda of how to participate in that meeting, how to submit comments, or how to speak during the meeting. We'll also send out a notification when we have the short-term rental survey results and the Q&A is updated on the website, the 2 different options to look at that. And just as a reminder, the survey results are available in 2 different options. There will be a single PDF with all of the comments listed, so you can scroll through all 3,680 responses and review those. There's also a way where you can kind of dive into the data a little bit through the Open Town Hall portal. You can filter the results by demographics, by the question that was asked, by the, it's escaping me, by the neighborhood that folks made comments in. So if you want to see what folks in North Forest Beach are saying, who registered and put their address in, you can see that. Now you can't see, folks' addresses, but if you registered and said, I want my name to be on there, your name will be on there. But that's a way to take a look at that data for yourself. And of course, all of the information in the short-term rental initiative includes all the presentations we've done before, the PowerPoints, all the information about the project is on that town website for your review. And we were scheduled to end at 4:30 today. If we don't, Mr. Ross?
Oh, I just wanted to follow up on one thing. One person talked about the repeat infractions could potentially revoke a owner's license to be able to rent. And they had talked about verification of the complaint. I know in a lot of areas, you have residents that are long-term that are near short-terms and they don't want them there. That's the whole reason they want this ordinance. And what happens if you start getting someone calling constantly to complain when there's certainly noise, but nothing that's offensive or would raise to the level of a nuisance, and they keep calling the number? Or perhaps if you are on Airbnb, you can only vet the guests so much. You can vet them of what their ratings are on an online platform, perhaps. But there's no guarantee when you book someone, that they will actually be quiet and not cause any disturbance. So I guess the concern was if you just happen to be the unlucky owner that happened to have 2 or 3 people within 3 months that caused a noise complaint, that you would have your license revoked. I think it would be more on the behavior of how you handled it versus the unluckiness of actually happening to have 3 people in a row or something that were really noisy. So, I'm hoping it would be more on the behavior of the property management company on behalf of the owner or the owner themselves versus to have the owner punished because they just by luck happened to have 3 guests that were noisy in a short period of time. So I guess that all goes back to the verification of the complaints and, is the enforcement because of poor response, or is it because of just, dumb luck that you happen to get 3 people that were super noisy? Because I know that if we respond, I talked earlier about our agents would have a very limited scope of what we could do when we go out there. South Carolina law doesn't allow us to go in the backyard or anything. So we can't really do anything other than maybe potentially knock on the door without 24 hours notice. It's very limited what we could do. So I just wanted to know, how that would work.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to clarify. The intention, in terms of verification of complaints, that's exactly it. I think if there is a concern that someone is causing a public nuisance to the point where town council would consider revoking their business license, that needs to be based on evidence. And that's exactly where the town code enforcement would come into play. In investigating those complaints, verifying that they're accurate, understanding the context of those complaints before moving forward with any kind of hearing about a business license. Again, if someone was being harassed by a neighbor, there are methods in place right now in our legal system to handle harassment. It's the same type of harassment, but any decisions would need to be based on the fact that an owner wasn't making a good faith effort and taking reasonable steps that other folks do to manage their short-term rentals. So I know that there are a lot of options that different people use, and we don't want to dictate how you decide to screen your guests or get guests in the house. I think that's up to the owner. They can decide how they want to do that. Other people there are a variety of different options that folks have used, including a deposit. And if there's a complaint, you lose your deposit. That's justified. And again, that would be a contract between the owner and the guest. There are products that are coming up that I'm reading about that are interesting that are noise monitoring options that some folks may want to use. Now, we wouldn't at this point be recommending or requiring that, but that could be an option for owners who have maybe properties for whatever reason that they've had a few different noise complaints about. It could be that we talk to them and say, what are you using to advertise your property, give us an idea of how you're running the business. We can compare that with how other folks are doing best practices and kind of discuss that. I hope that answers your question or addresses at least the points that you raised. And thanks again for bringing that up. Mr. Storin.
Hi, Anne.
Hi.
Well, first of all, thank you for all these sessions. We've listened to them all. I've one question and 2 statements. The question basically is, what qualifies as a response within an hour? So in the recommendations, it was suggested that there would be a response within an hour. So I'd be interested to hear what that response looks like. And then 2 statements. We've heard over the last number of months a lot about property rights, and we don't want to infringe on property rights. So, but everything I've heard about is the investors' property rights. What about the property rights of the residents? Surely they have property rights as well. And then the last statement is, and again, this was a common theme in a lot of the presentations, that people purchase property with the intent of renting them out to defray cost. What about the residents? The residents, they purchased their homes in single family neighborhoods, but they're not looking to rent them out. All they wanted to do was enjoy, a reasonable quality of life. So surely they're entitled to that as well. So that's it. So if you could answer the first question, I would appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us again. Our intent is that the response within an hour, and we haven't specified a method of that. Some folks are folks who like to talk to someone on the phone, and some folks are texting or emailing type people. I think the intention is that there would be a response to the complainant within an hour within the method that was used to contact them. We need to discuss details on that, and I appreciate you bringing that up. But we're not intending that whatever the issue is will be resolved within an hour. The focus is that there would be a response within an hour. Now, in some cases, it could be that can be resolved immediately. If there is a party or a noise issue, the owner or agent can contact the renters and tell them, hey, turn the music down, close the doors, get everyone inside because it's nighttime. Or if it's daytime and an unreasonably loud amount of music, hey, you're disturbing the peace, even though it's not, technically quiet hours, this is unreasonable. And that could be resolved. In some cases, it can't be. And to your points that your comments that you made, I certainly tried to address that in my presentation and in my comments. And I apologize if that wasn't conveyed. We understand that residents who own property have as many rights as folks who own their property who don't live here and want to rent it. And I think that there is an understanding that there needs to be a balance and respect for the fact that if people moved into an area that was designated, especially if it's designated as a residential neighborhood, they reasonably have the expectation that it will be a residential neighborhood. Now, if that changes over time, that, as I said, is something that we need to discuss. And folks like yourself have felt, yes, I mean, I didn't expect to move into an area with this number of short-term rentals. It's more of a commercial use. So I appreciate your points, and I'm glad you brought them up, and thank you for joining us again. Mr. Jimison?
Yeah, this is my third session, and maybe I missed it, but had you talked with, the behind the sea pines, the association leaders as well? Because I mean, as I look at the 5 things you're trying to manage: property, safety, noise, trash, parking, my property owner association and CSA and Sea Pines, I have covenants that cover all of that. And now I have a third master I have to comply with. It just adds more hassle with no more effect that I can see. You're going to have the occasional bad renter, as I've mentioned before. I don't want them back because whatever happens outside the door is happening inside the door, and it costs a lot in terms of damage. And I've had experiences where I've disinvited guests that never made any, there were no complaints other than I came in and looked at the place and it was a mess. So you don't want them back. But I'm just curious, again, this particular session dealt more with the details of protocol and who gets first call. Or somebody calling the sheriff, does it get ping-ponged around? We've got CSA security, which basically is an extension of the sheriff's office inside the gate. They would respond based on any violation of the covenants anyway. So this just seems like a lot more redundancy with very little impact if it's behind the gate. What I heard in the last several sessions was this seemed to exist more so in those areas without any association oversight. And you get into the large properties where you'll get multiple families and groups coming in for purposes of partying or defraying costs with having 4 or more families in a huge place. But at the same time, I keep hearing the theme that, don't know if it's the majority, but a significant number of short-term rental properties are those people that basically treat them as second homes and defray costs or intend to retire to that house. And we're being treated more and more like an income producing property that just wants to sweat the assets. So I really enjoyed Mr. Prohaska's comments, because I think he was trying to isolate where the problem was and be cautious about a peanut butter approach to this thing, where you just spread, the same requirements across, all the different categories of short-term rentals. So I guess I'm curious if you did talk to any of the associations, what kind of feedback you got from them, because it just sounds like a lot of redundancy to me.
Thank you for your comments. I appreciate it. We certainly don't want to create a burden with no purpose. Our intent is to create basically uniform expectations. And initial thought about how to confirm that folks are meeting that expectations would be submitting a form along with your business license stating that you do affirm and meet those expectations. So presumably if you are operating your property, it's well managed, and we've heard from a lot of folks, and most folks do manage their properties very well. If there are incidents, it's due to the guests, and you can't control all guests. The intention is that you would already be doing the things that we are asking you to affirm that you do. And if there is an issue, we would turn to that and say, well, you submitted an application for short-term rental with your business license. You said that you would have someone who's available to respond to issues. And we've had several issues come up and there's been no response. Or, well, we've had an issue where, someone complained that the guests who are staying in your house are parking kind of on this half on the street, half on your neighbor's lawn. This is an issue. You said, here is the number of spaces that I have that are, parking spaces that are on site. What is the issue? You're not meeting what you are saying that you're doing in terms of good property management. So that's our thinking, is that it would create a baseline set of expectations for everyone. Now, in terms of how that interacts with communities where they already have standards in place, we are certainly in conversations with those folks and have asked for their feedback on these initial recommendations, and are trying to ensure that anything that we are asking people to affirm is not something that is in violation of a private covenant or ordinance. And so, yes, we are in conversation with those folks and are getting their feedback on the initial recommendations. And it could be in some cases that the town code enforcement never gets involved because the issues are resolved by those private security companies that work for those larger gated communities, in which case the expectations are being met for that short-term rental. I hope that answers your question or speaks to what your points you're trying to make. Mr. Soren?
Sorry, my apologies. Mr. Jimmerson just got in a little bit too quick for me. On coming back to the qualifies as a response, my assumption, and I would assume your assumption is the same, autoresponder would not be qualified as a response. Is that correct? So if you say the ABC company is currently closed, we'll get back to you within 24 hours type of thing, that is not a response.
That's correct. Someone understanding what the problem is and saying, okay, well, here's if it's a parking issue, we will investigate and try to get the folks to not park on your property, or I'm going to call the folks who are having the party and tell them to turn the noise down. Some sort of not an automated response. That's correct. Thank you.
Real human.
Yes.
Okay, appreciate it. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it. Okay. Again, just as we've got 10 more minutes in our scheduled time, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen with 2 conversation bubbles. If you'd like to type in a question and have it answered by staff, please feel free to do that. And again, a record of the questions that were asked and a transcript of and a recording of this webinar will be made available on the town's website afterwards, so you can review that. Oh, Mr. Seister again?
Yes, Gerald
Sure.
Seister. I'm a resident in North Forest Beach, and I also have a condo in South Forest Beach. So I have interest both as a resident and as a short-term rental with a management company. I brought it up before, and Mr. Ross addressed a lot of issues. He's I guess, a short-term property management company representative, and obviously he's not interested in having his people go out and being an extension of the police department, the county police department. I get that, I understand that. However, if a resident complains and that complaint that is going on in real time is not verified in real time, I can't see how, without verification, how it is enforceable. So if this ordinance goes out and it doesn't have real teeth because it's not enforceable, because you can't verify the complaint in real time, meaning the sheriff's department simply doesn't have enough people, the code enforcement officers don't work at night, there's so many, the town just doesn't, and the county doesn't have the resources to verify any complaints real time. So if it goes before the council and there's just a bunch of complaints from a few neighbors and they're not verified, how does the council act on that?
Sure. Thank you for your question. I appreciate that. That would be up to the council. They have the discretion to review the evidence that's presented to them. I will say that as we move through focusing, just speaking to the ordinance that we're looking at right now, those performance standards and moving forward, our intention is to bring a draft ordinance to the Public Planning Committee during their February meeting on February 24th, and have them review the ordinance as it is. And based on their feedback, whether they support all or some of or none of the recommendations that we're proposing in that ordinance, we would then have more detailed information about how we can enforce that ordinance. And some of those issues that you speak to regarding how the town code enforcement officers would interface with the sheriff, or what previous folks have mentioned about like the private companies that are associated with the gated communities, how all of that works, I think are going to be clearer to us, and we can provide details on that as we move forward in the process. Hopefully some of the previous discussion has illuminated what our initial thoughts are about how this would be handled. But you're exactly right. I think without evidence, it would be difficult for town council to make a determination that a business license would be revoked. So yes, I think that there would need to be evidence of the violation in real time. I suspect that in some cases, video evidence would be provided, because that is more frequently folks will take a video of something that occurs that they have an issue with. But that's conjecture on my part, and we would have more details on that and provided by our legal department as we move forward and talk about implementing the ordinance and enforcing it. Okay, we have a few more minutes, about 6 more minutes before we're supposed to wrap up. We don't necessarily need to go to 4:30. If no one else has any other questions, I'm not trying to pressure anyone to speak up. Oh, Mr. Shepherd. Yes, sir.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I might have missed this. I was in and out doing some other things. Someone had asked about the fencing around the pools. Is there a number of drownings that they've tracked in on Hilton Head with short-term rentals? Do they actually have a number, and that's why they're trying to put the fences up, or is it just they just want to make people put fences up?
Yes, sir. I think the idea is a basic safety standard. Obviously, we want to prevent any loss of life of any pet or child or adult who stays on the island. The thought behind requiring pool safety, and it doesn't necessarily need to be fencing, but pool safety standards, is that folks who are on vacation are frequently in a location that they're not familiar with. They are, frequently visiting, with folks and catching up with friends and relatives and excited to see them, and maybe aren't paying as close of attention as they would at home to pets or kids or other folks who are vulnerable to drowning. And we want to increase the safety standards and have a baseline safety that folks can use so that we do prevent those accidents from happening or tragedies. Our thought is that if fencing is not feasible or is not allowed by your POA or HOA, folks could take advantage of some of the new technologies that have come online for pool safety. So there are door alarms that can be installed if you have a door that leads out to the pool area and that door is left ajar for a certain amount of time, where if you didn't quite close the door or you're just in and out of the house, and a child or a pet could slip outside and get into a pool unseen, that alarm would sound. I know there are also alarms that can be used to monitor water levels in pools, so while they're not in use. So if you have an alarm and a child or a pet falls into the pool, the alarm would sound, and you'd be aware of that. So the goal again is, obviously to prevent any loss of life in a pool, and especially for folks who are in an environment or in a situation during a time where they're maybe out of their natural element, to provide a little more safety for them in those situations. seeing no additional questions, I'm going to wrap up our meeting today. As we wrap up, I would like to thank very much our town council members who are able to join us today. Ms. Becker, Mr. Ames, Mr. Lennox, and Mr. Brown. Again, I'm part of the staff team working on short-term rentals. Joining me today are Renee Phillips, who ran the webinar, Terry Lewis, Jamie Lopko, Teresa Haley, and Nicole Dixon were also assisting. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and a copy will be available on the town's website, along with the Q&A and the questions that were brought up live and asked live. You can share comments using the comment form on the town's short-term rental initiative page, and that information will be shared with the Public Planning Committee. And again, please sign up for project updates to be notified of upcoming meeting dates, to see those agendas, and any additional information we put on the town's website, such as the results of the survey. And we received a great number of results, and we really appreciate folks' input on that. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great day.